Yeah, same thing.
Same class.
Well, yeah, I'm supposed to be back in the factory he teaches like American business. He's like, at least he's like for this semester. So he's going to be gone until February. So he's Berkeley.
Oh, okay. Oh, I was like, whoa.
We're not that bad. All right.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We didn't do too much travel. But towards the end, we got to go to
well, you know,
like politically?
No,
or
like,
like yeah, it was, yeah. Yeah. One attack, like,
oh, there was
we were I wasn't kind of actually doing it, but we were doing this. Yeah. No, I'm over it. I'm getting. Everyone was really sick. We got and then managed to help you.
Is there an office?
There is. Oh, there is. Someone's from
You mean the skate on?
Yeah, I know.
It's not part-time.
It said someone who worked with the director there.
One of the students?
Yeah.
It was here, wasn't it? Huh.
He had been. I was like, oh.
It was in the
Yeah. Maybe it was I was like, what do you do? No, I haven't before. So I'll do it for like half hour and then I'll go. And then I want to
I don't know.
try to do
Oh, some of them, yeah, they're pretty good. Yeah. Probably, like that. So, yeah, he's really pretty good. You know, so she's good. No, Jeff's okay. Because, he's not that we still have that. So, Yeah. Yeah.
Prevented us from being American home.
That's fine, right?
No, I'm not.
Oh, really? Good. Wow, he's just fine. Yeah, no, that's why. Good. And then you're done. Oh, they did? Okay, good. Good. They're gonna pay you? Okay, just check.
Like some form of recognition.
All right.
Either way. Okay. So they let me know, maybe I'll kind of be ours week there. They give me starting off right now. Starting with it's the same department where I interned, and I was wondering, I was like, done that, you know, maybe I want to or try to do whatever, you know,
That's right.
people,
But it's also but it's sincere. It's verified.
See what I can find out. You're not going to go see this
But what do you do?
Hello. Can you please be seated so we could start with this panel? No one's listening though. Okay. Okay, this is the panel on American policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict during the period of the Johnson administration. I am Arthur Klinghoffer, and I'm a political science professor at Rutgers University. And I'm surrounded here today on this panel, literally, if not figuratively, in an academic sense, by a group of expert historians on modern Middle Eastern history. And in dividing up the time, each presenter will have 15 minutes, and our commentator will have 15 minutes, and then we will devote whatever time remains to questions from the audience. Our first speaker today will be Dr. David Lesh, to be followed by Dr. Peter Hahn, Dr. Lily Polyak, Dr. Arlene Lazarowitz, and then our commentator, Dr. Warren Cohn. So first, Dr. David Lesh of Trinity University.
Thank you, Arthur. I see my task here today, at least as it was described to me, to provide some historical context. We've seen a lot of discussion so far about specific incidents such as the USS Liberty, the Soviet warning, and so forth, but Michael Oren and Bill Brand started to get into the question of international context and so forth in their commentaries in the last panel. So I see myself basically as painting some broad strokes that at least somewhat capture the transition in U.S. foreign policy in the early to mid-1960s that helped define and shape the parameters in which the 1967 war occurred and U.S. policy toward the war. Now, I don't, since I'm focusing on U.S. policy, and as you'll see, I'm a tad critical of it during this period, I don't mean that to suggest or to imply that that the U.S. is somehow to blame for the '67 war, nor does this panel, I think, mean to imply that. That's just the dynamic which we are discussing. Obviously, in my view, the blame lies elsewhere, mostly with the parties in the region itself. So again, I'm going to be providing some of this historical context. Now, U.S. policy in the Middle East, certainly from the late 1950s, had moved from the Cold War-induced Manichaean approach toward the Middle East to a more nuanced posture embodied in National Security Council Resolution 5820 of October-November 1958. Which really marked a process that actually had begun in the year prior to that, 1957, during the American-Syrian crisis, when the United States and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt had worked out something of a modus vivendi regarding that crisis, which actually contributed to the formation of the United Arab Republic in February 1958. So Arab nationalism by the late 50s, early 60s was now seen in Washington as not being inherently anti-West, so the stage was set, as we know, for a reversal in U.S. relations with Egypt. In order to safeguard oil supplies, which really meant, of course, protecting Saudi Arabia and curtail Soviet influence, Washington now would try to work with Nasser and Arab nationalism rather than against it. It was hoped that this might relieve some of the pressure of the quote-unquote Arab radicals on Riyadh while taking advantage of the apparent split between communists and nationalists in the Arab world that was made more manifest after the 1958 revolution in Iraq. And although this policy would remain in effect for the remainder of the Eisenhower administration, it would really not be implemented with any concerted effort until Kennedy came to power and would take some concrete steps to implement it, or at least attempt to do so. Now, while other issues, certainly Berlin, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course Vietnam, were higher on the foreign policy priority list during the abbreviated Kennedy administration, the Middle East did receive some serious attention. Kennedy brought a whole new ideological conception of the Middle East and the Third World to the White House. He viewed these areas as centers of opportunity for advancing American power. His policy team took a decidedly more positive stance toward non-aligned countries. They also advocated expanding economic development programs on both a bilateral and multilateral basis to bolster regimes and movements sympathetic to the United States. This became particularly poignant coming on the heels of Khrushchev's speech of January 1961 promoting wars of liberation, national wars of liberation in the Third World. So popular nationalists were not to be feared but courted, and in the Middle East, of course, this meant Gamal Abdel Nasser. In addition, after the Syrian secession from the United Arab Republic in September 1961, Nasser was seen in Washington to be in a weakened position, in addition to some other problems he was encountering, especially economically, and therefore less able to stir up trouble in the region, yet more amenable to U.S. designs. Of course, an alternative view at the time, held both by the Saudis and the Israelis, was that free of constraints, Nasser would use this honeymoon with the United States to enhance his position in the region at the expense of the Saudis and or the Israelis, which would ultimately pit him against Washington in the long run. Now, recognizing as well the shifting winds in Washington, Nasser also sent out some positive signals. After his visit to Cairo, Chester Bowles, Kennedy's ambassador at large to the Third World, which in itself is an indication of the new policy direction of the administration, in an oft-quoted comment said the following, quote, "The leaders of the UAR are pragmatists searching for techniques that will enable them to expand their economy rapidly and to maintain their political grip. If Nasser can gradually be led to forsake the microphone for the bulldozer, he may assume a key role in bringing the Middle East peacefully into our modern world." Now, the Kennedy team, or at least some of them, many of them, were made up of policymakers convinced that state-to-state relations could be scientifically managed, even though the relationship, the policy or the relationship between Nasser and Kennedy was quite unofficial, carried out through personal diplomacy of letters exchanged between them. They believed that the relative quiescent state of the Middle East at the time, at least at one level, could be used to their advantage in order to sway at least Egypt onto the path of socioeconomic development and modernization. After all, had not the Kennedy administration changed the potential red revolution in Iran into a white one. As such, the Arab-Israeli conflict could indeed, as an Egyptian official put it, placed in the icebox in order to allow time for the new relationship to develop. Under these favorable regional conditions, uncomplicated by a multitude of forces as they had been in the past, and soon would be even more so in the future, an Israeli-Arab accord might be possible. That is, its conclusion did not have to first await a crisis situation. As a result, obviously, relations improved between the United States and Egypt under Kennedy, the hallmark of which was of course, the grain shipments to Egypt under already existing PL 480 program. Seeing that this relative calm was an opportune time to begin to build bridges between Israel and the Arab states on substantive issues, Kennedy pushed forward a new plan, the Johnson Plan, named after Dr. Joseph Johnson, in mid-62, making good on an earlier promise to Arab leaders to deal directly with the Palestinian refugee problem, in the process of which it was hoped that a new dialogue could be established between Israel and Egypt that might possibly lead to an overall settlement. So much for keeping the Arab-Israeli issue in the icebox, which may have been the inevitable conundrum of the situation. That is, progress with Egypt continued as long as the Arab-Israeli dispute and the Palestinian problem was kept in the icebox. But that very same progress was deemed the cornerstone of an overall settlement, which ultimately reattached the U.S.-Egyptian relationship to the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially when the Hawk missiles under the Kennedy administration were used in part as inducement to Israel to sign along the dotted line regarding the Johnson Plan, as well as to wean them away from developing a nuclear capability at the time. The hope the plan had, of course, was finally dashed in September 1962 in Yemen with the overthrow of the monarchy of Imam Mohammed al-Badr. The event, although a minor distraction in and of itself, did divide the Arab world, again, in such a way that placed the United States in a very difficult position between Egypt and the pro-U.S. conservative monarchies, Saudi Arabia and Jordan. And this civil war in Yemen would be a persistent irritant to U.S.-Egyptian relations, especially under a less sympathetic president, less sympathetic toward Israel, toward Nasser, that is, under President Johnson. So Kennedy's attempted balancing act failed, and the question in my mind is not, had Kennedy lived, would relations with Egypt and Nasser continue to deteriorate, but had the Yemeni civil war been resolved, successfully or efficiently resolved in a somewhat more speedy manner, would the United States have remained engaged with Nasser regardless of whether Kennedy or Johnson was still in the White House? And that engagement, or continued engagement at least some level, could have proved to have been quite valuable in the lead up to any war, especially in 1967. Now, Johnson's foreign policy, as some have alluded to already, lacked the subtle distinctions between communists and nationalists that Kennedy had made. His policy toward the Middle East seemed to be something of a throwback to the early Eisenhower years. It was a globalist foreign policy, one in which the Soviet Union was seen as lurking behind every trouble spot, and nationalist leaders were either willing or unwilling dupes of Kremlin designs. In fact, the Middle East, as again was alluded to earlier, was only important as a function of the Cold War, which meant that it would only become important when the one concentric circle of the Cold War was pierced by the concentric circle of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That can only be intertwined and intersect in a crisis situation. Again, something I think Bill Brand was referring to in a different fashion earlier on. But whereas Eisenhower and Dulles tended to see Israel, as well as Nasser and others, as something of an obstacle to achieve their objectives in the region, Johnson was sympathetic toward Israel and developed a very close relationship with Prime Minister Eshkol. And of course, as we have seen in recent years, personal relationships between a U.S. president and the leaders of other countries can prove to be very decisive in terms of foreign policy. Egypt's continuing presence in Yemen, its backing of Congo rebels, among other things, tended to confirm for Johnson that Kennedy's wooing of the Egyptian president had been ill-conceived. The Johnson administration increased U.S. support for conservative Arab regimes threatened by Nasserism and built upon Kennedy's military aid commitments to Israel. Again, although Kennedy's policy implied a link between military aid and concessions on the refugee resettlement plan, whereas Johnson's military assistance to Israel was based, in my mind, as much on affinity in domestic politics as well as any overall strategic design. And I wonder how much of this change in looking at this was really palpable in Washington. This is something that may be revealed in the Frus documents, as well as some of the people maybe sitting here today who were in the government at that particular time. It seems to have been clear in places in Cairo, this shift between Kennedy and Johnson. And of course, anytime the U.S. engages in a foreign policy approach or a foreign policy initiative or in some crisis situation or event, every word that emanates out of the mouths of Washington is digested and examined again across the world, whereas it rarely exists at that type of level in the other direction. And the shift from Nasser's perspective was much more tangible and contributed certainly to his sense that he was a marked man under the Johnson administration. But the Middle East under the Johnson administration, at least until the June 1967 Arab-Israeli War, took a back seat to his Great Society programs and the deepening involvement in Vietnam, again, as has been stated or alluded to earlier. If the Kennedy administration took advantage of the relative calm in the Middle East as an opportunity to take steps toward a settlement of the Arab-Israeli dispute, the Johnson administration savored it as one less distraction to deal with so that it could concentrate its energies elsewhere. So in the period between 63 and 67, the Middle East seemed on the surface to be sufficiently insulated from a crisis atmosphere. The Arab Cold War boiling beneath the surface was not detected, I shouldn't say not detected, it was just not viewed as the threat to regional stability that it would become if it was possible to do so at all. The Soviet interest in expanding its influence in the region was appreciated in Washington and countered with military aid to a number of conservative Arab states and to Israel as well, which appeared contradictory and inversely proportional to U.S.-Egyptian relations. But the Kremlin's role in feeding more tension into the Arab Cold War by focusing Arab hostilities on Israel was not completely digested by an administration that had become totally consumed with the foreign policy and domestic policy repercussions of Vietnam. Whereas the Kennedy administration, as I said earlier, saw some level of opportunity and attempted to build upon the situation, although possibly without the concerted effort necessary to achieve its objectives, the Johnson administration was content to play a traditional balance of power game in the region that would keep the entire Middle East in the icebox for the time being, or at least it was hoped. Now, the war, of course, brought it out of the icebox a bit. It perforce caused the superpowers to become more intimately involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict with all the associated dangers of that. In order to avoid that, the Johnson administration initially engaged in some steps that might diffuse the crisis and create parameters for a peaceful resolution of conflict. The 5 principles for peace shortly after the war. As an example, Arab-Israeli hostilities were still acute, and Johnson obviously did not want a second barrier erected in addition to the one he had in Vietnam to the quote-unquote woman he really loved, that is the Great Society programs. In general, there was a great deal of resentment in the Arab world toward the United States for, in their eyes, aiding and abetting in Israel's overwhelming victory. This viewpoint, I think, confused the Johnson administration's relative passivity during the June crisis from their point of view and aloofness before the war with intent. Now, obviously, it would be later be determined that an international forum, the United Nations, should take the lead in addressing the issue, producing Resolution 242, which I'm sure the rest of the panelists will comment on all of that in much more detail. However, by involving the Soviet Union in the process and collecting its vote for a peaceful resolution on record in the Security Council, the Johnson administration, in my opinion, believed it had again insulated the conflict from direct superpower confrontation, which greatly simplified the issue for the administration. The United States was not willing, possibly not even able, to insert itself into the mix, and the forces in the region were not, on the surface at least, predisposed toward a negotiated settlement. Israel felt invincible. In fact, the whole problem with the '67 war, in addition to many other ones, obviously, but the main one is that Israel won too damn decisively. Absolutely won too damn decisively. And of course produced the asymmetrical diplomatic environment following the war, and it would take another war to add a little bit more symmetry into the equation. The Arab states obviously wanted to improve their bargaining position before any negotiations. There had been shown some measure of flexibility on the parties involved following the war at a time, again, where it was possibly propitious for something to occur on the diplomatic front, but the Johnson administration was looking elsewhere. The issue was insulated by 242. The Tet Offensive began in early '68, and the administration obviously decided not to run for office. It was primarily interested in leaving as soon as possible with as little damage as possible. So the episodic nature of U.S. foreign policy, changing from administration to administration in style and substance, makes it difficult, as we all know, to implement a sustained, coordinated, and consistent diplomatic initiative. And there exists the inherent paradox of the globalist nature of American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East at the time. The relative calm that compelled the Kennedy administration to adopt an active posture toward the Middle East equation and created the opportunity for a settlement of the conflict also predetermined that it would not be at or near the top of the foreign policy priority list. Thus, it would be without the presidential and bureaucratic commitment necessary for creative implementation. Under less nuanced administrations, such as Johnson, even Nixon, certainly after the failure of the Rogers Plan until '73, policy inertia existed as long as other more acute and salient foreign policy objectives were pursued. The '73 war with oil, a bloodied Israel, and of course, a near superpower confrontation obviously brought it out of the icebox again with the concerted effort of all parties concerned to bring about a solution. If there's a lesson to be learned from this period of discussion is perhaps that policymakers should not necessarily mistake relative calm at one level for quiescence at a multitude of levels, and that the exploration of and extrapolation from a multidimensional analysis and resulting appreciation of the Middle East matrix may provide insights that recommend a more active approach even during apparent crisis-free periods. And a final note, I was just rereading some materials on the '67 war, flying into Boston and flying into here. I I told Bill Kwan, I dug out his Decade of Decisions book from '76 or '77, which still holds quite well, actually, because it was a lot thinner than his peace process book to carry on. But just reading over that and some other things, I was struck again by the question of perception. And that's something that's very important, the perception from Cairo and Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Washington and Moscow. And again, as I said earlier, everything emanating out of Washington was examined and examined and examined again. We, however, episodically examine something, turn the page, and move on. It's the bane of being a globalist superpower. And I'm reminded of how little, at least official or overt time, that Johnson actually spent on the crisis as opposed to Eshkol and Nasser, who are obviously living, eating, breathing, sleeping the crisis, getting ill during the crisis. Now, I don't know how much Johnson was thinking about it at night or when he went to bed or so forth and so on. Maybe this is something that these documents or something else will be able to talk about. But how can anyone be on the same page in terms of policy during the war, before the war, even after the war, when they're not even reading the same book? Israel and Egypt obviously had Suez in mind dramatically for different reasons, obviously. Egypt hoping to replicate some of the success, Israel hoping to change things that occurred after the '56 Suez War, whereas the United States had Suez obviously in mind. They had the superpower Cold War obviously very much front in mind. They even had the Cuban Missile Crisis in mind, and they had the Vietnam War in mind. All of these things constructing U.S. foreign policy and reactions during the crisis. Many, many more variables, many, many more interests. So the '67 war did not entirely remove the Arab-Israeli conflict from the icebox, and only in attempts to place it as much as possible after the war back into an insulated condition. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Our next paper will be presented by Dr. Peter Hahn of Ohio State University.
Thank you. This paper is entitled An Ominous Moment, Lyndon Johnson and the Six-Day War. At 4:35 a.m. on June 5, 1967, National Security Advisor Walt Rostow awakened President Johnson to report that an Arab-Israeli war had erupted. Johnson recalled in his memoirs that this news deeply disturbed him because he had worked hard to avert such hostilities, which seemed, and I quote, potentially far more dangerous than the war in Southeast Asia, unquote. His concern peaked at 8 o'clock that morning when Secretary of Defense McNamara reported that the Soviets had activated the hotline. As Johnson recalled, McNamara's words that, quote, the hotline is up, were ominous, unquote. Having long recognized the Middle East as a potential source of regional and global conflict, the Johnson administration had pursued three broad objectives in the region prior to 1967. First, U.S. officials underscored the importance of practicing anti-Soviet containment there. Second, U.S. officials sought political stability in the Middle East. And third, they aimed to maintain a delicate balance between antagonistic factions in the region and to remain cordial to all powers there. By early 1967, however, the Johnson administration's policy faced several obstacles. For one, Soviet political overtures to the UAR, Syria, and Iraq challenged the ability of the United States to remain friendly to those states, indirectly threatened the integrity of Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and portended a resurgence of Arab-Israeli conflict. Apparently, with the endorsement of Soviet leaders, Syrian officials condoned terrorism against Israel as a means of demoralizing its population and discouraging immigration there. Palestinian refugees and other Arab nationalists directed some of their anti-Israeli passions against the traditional U.S. support of the Jewish state. Administration officials recognized that conditions might worsen quickly. Indeed, political conditions in the Middle East deteriorated quite rapidly in 1967. A series of incidents along Israel's borders with the UAR in Syria stoked deadly tension. Israeli fighters engaged and downed Syrian jets on April 7th, and in May, a wave of violence in northern Israel prompted an Israeli threat to occupy Damascus and change the Syrian government. The border tension escalated into a crisis on May 16th, when Nasser expelled the UN troops that had policed the Sinai since 1957 and advanced 600 tanks and 3 infantry divisions into that region. Rumors immediately surfaced that Israel would launch a preemptive strike against this provocation. In this initial phase of the crisis, Johnson urged restraint on all powers and specifically rejected Israeli pleas for a security assurance. The Middle East crisis deepened on May 22nd when Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and Israeli leaders threatened to fight to reopen the waterway. As tensions mounted, U.S. officials took 4 steps to head off war. First, Johnson promptly and publicly declared the UAR blockade, and I quote, illegal and potentially disastrous to the cause of peace, unquote, and he urged its reversal. Johnson sent former Secretary of the Treasury Robert Anderson to appeal to Nasser in person to resolve the crisis by lifting the blockade, but Nasser refused to desist. Second, U.S. officials encouraged the UAR and Israel to cooperate with UN diplomacy to end the crisis. Johnson told the National Security Council on May 24th that, quote, I want to play every card in the UN, unquote. Ambassador Abba Eban indicated, however, that Israeli officials, and again I quote, have absolutely no faith in the possibility of anything useful coming out of the UN, unquote. Third, U.S. officials tried to restrain Israel from launching a military attack designed to reopen the straits. Johnson and his advisors realized that such a feat would require them to perform a delicate balancing act. If, at the one extreme, they offered Israel no support, or if, at the other extreme, they firmly endorsed Israel's position on the straits, then they might trigger the same outcome, namely Israeli military action against the UAR. Such action would place the U.S. in a difficult situation, given that domestic political support of Israel would make it hard to fulfill U.S. pledges to counter intra-regional aggression. Yet not stopping Israeli action, as Ambassador to Cairo Richard Nolte warned, would incur, quote, heavy cost to us in terms of political, economic, and other relationships in the Arab world, unquote. U.S. officials resolved to head off Israeli preemption, both by warning firmly against the use of force and by offering alternative means to guarantee freedom of the seas. U.S. officials tried to implement this delicate policy in meetings with Eban in Washington on May 25th and 26th. Dean Rusk recorded after the meeting that, quote, we put the case against preemptive strikes to Ambassador Eban very hard, both from the military and the political points of view. Preemptive action by Israel would cause extreme difficulty for the United States, unquote. The formal record of conversation reveals, moreover, that, and I quote, with emphasis and solemnity, the President repeated twice, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to go alone, unquote. Johnson also refused to reissue a security guarantee, writing to Prime Minister Eshkol that, quote, it is essential that Israel not take any preemptive military action and thereby make itself responsible for the initiation of hostilities, unquote. Fourth, U.S. officials decided to contest Nasser's blockade of the Straits by organizing concerted action by Western maritime powers to block it. The U.S. effort to head off war by appealing to the UAR to reverse course, endorsing UN diplomacy, restraining Israel, and organizing the maritime operation immediately encountered a series of problems. For starters, Israeli insecurity mounted quickly amidst reports that UAR units in the Sinai were armed with chemical weapons. In the absence of an ironclad U.S. security guarantee or a promise to break the Gulf of Aqaba blockade, Eshkol wrote to Johnson, additional U.S. appeals for restraint, quote, will lack any moral or logical basis, unquote. Second, administration officials realized that the task of organizing the maritime operation faced severe obstacles at home and among allied powers. Johnson delayed asking Congress to authorize the operation because, according to Rusk, and I quote, the problem of Tonkin Gulf-itis remains serious, unquote, and State Department negotiations with other maritime states on the logistics of the operation hit several bottlenecks. Third, U.S. officials became painfully aware that the maritime plan faced political, economic, and military problems. A blockade seemed unlikely to force Nasser to relent. Arab states might instead retaliate with painful economic sanctions against the West. Moreover, the Pentagon estimated that enforcement of the blockade would overextend U.S. armed forces and risk an embarrassing military setback. By early June, U.S. officials realized that they were boxed in by an impossible situation. Johnson remained convinced that Israel would escalate to war unless the UAR rescinded the blockade. Yet State Department officials warned that the maritime plan to reopen the straits appeared to Arab leaders as a U.S. capitulation to Israel, forced the pro-Western Arab states to endorse Nasser's position, eroded U.S. influence in the Arab world, and opened the door to Soviet influence. In such a situation, U.S. officials naturally considered the advantages of simply allowing Israel to escalate to hostilities. In contrast to the tactical difficulties of U.S. military operations in the Gulf, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair General Wheeler reported on May 24th, and I quote, the Israelis can hold their own in a war, unquote, against the Arab states. Harold Saunders of the National Security Council suggested that if the U.S. had allowed Israel to preempt in late May, a better outcome might have resulted, namely the defeat of Nasser without U.S. involvement. He suggested that, quote, we ought to consider admitting that we have failed and allow the fighting to continue, unquote. Some scholars assert that in late May and early June, Johnson deliberately signaled to Israel that he would not object if it initiated military action against the UAR. William Quandt has argued that despite Johnson's official protestations against war, the president suddenly signaled Eshkol through unofficial channels that he would not object if Israel preempted. In Quandt's view, Johnson abandoned his red light position of categorical opposition to Israeli action for a yellow light position of not opposing while not specifically endorsing an Israeli attack. Quandt concludes that to the Israelis, and I quote, as for most motorists, the yellow light was tantamount to a green one, unquote. Avi Shalim further observes that in a conversation with Mossad Director Meir Amit in early June, McNamara, quote, gave Israel a green light to take military action against Egypt, unquote. As persuasive as Quandt and Shalim are, three caveats, in my judgment, limit the yellow light and green light theses. First, archival evidence demonstrates that Johnson remained skittish about Israeli preemption long after he might have flashed a yellow or green light to Eshkol. On June 3rd, for instance, the president notified Eshkol of his diplomatic efforts to reopen the straits, confirmed his commitment to the survival of Israel and the territorial integrity of all Middle East states, and urged Eshkol to refrain from aggression. Second, it seems plausible that Johnson expected Israel to initiate a test of Nasser's blockade of the straits rather than launch a full-scale attack on the UAR. NSC officials apparently anticipated that Israel would send a ship into the straits on June 11th and respond forcefully if the UAR stopped it. Thus, they resolved to seek a compromise solution to the standoff by polishing the maritime plan or getting Nasser to back down before that deadline. Assistant Secretary of State Lucius Battle assured Nasser, quote, that the United States strongly opposes aggression by anyone in the area in any form, unquote. It seems doubtful to me that the State Department would have issued such assurances had it expected Israel to invade the Sinai on June 5th. Third, the legacy of U.S.-Israeli security relations and the evidence of U.S.-Israeli differences of judgment during the crisis of '67 suggests that Israel would have launched a preemptive strike regardless of the U.S. position. Israeli leaders were convinced by early June that UAR forces in the Sinai posed a dire threat to their national survival. It is reasonable to assume that they were prepared to address this threat by means of their own choosing, regardless of the position of the United States, which was preoccupied in Vietnam and which occasionally pursued security objectives that clashed with Israel's. The Israeli attack on the UAR on June 5th quickly escalated into a major war of territorial conquest, and one that strained U.S. relations with both Israel and the Arab states. As the war unfolded, the United States adopted a three-track policy. First, it sought to end the war as soon as possible by pushing a ceasefire resolution through the UN Security Council and pressing all sides to honor it. The Johnson administration also sought to prevent Soviet political or military involvement in the war, which would seriously imperil Western interests in the Middle East and perhaps lead to global conflict. Third, the United States sought to build a permanent peace settlement over the ashes of the Six-Day War. Johnson administration officials understood that the success of any U.S. peace plan would depend on the willingness of Israel to compromise, but they soon realized that extracting concessions from Israel would prove difficult. Rostow advised Johnson that, quote, "We are clearly for both territorial integrity in the Middle East and for peace. Our powers to make peace, however, are extremely limited," unquote. Domestic political circumstances also limited the president's options. By the fall of 1967, U.S. efforts to make peace bore little fruit. Israel's position seemed to harden, the NSC noted in September, even as the Arab positions moderated. Rusk told the cabinet that, quote, "the outlook for the moment is for deadlock," unquote. The UN finally adopted Resolution 242, but deep disagreements over implementation blocked progress toward an actual resolution. The Arab-Israeli conflict confronted Lyndon Johnson with a difficult and dangerous situation. His ability to maintain a policy of containment, stability, and even-handedness in the Middle East collapsed under the strain of a UAR-Israeli crisis. Administration officials tried to defuse the crisis by persuading the UAR to reverse its provocative actions, restraining Israel from preempting, promoting UN peacekeeping, and promoting a multilateral operation to reopen the straits. Such U.S. diplomacy failed, however, to avert the outbreak of full-scale war on June 5th. Johnson and his advisors succeeded only modestly in achieving their objectives once the war erupted. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967 comprised a major setback for Lyndon Johnson. It undermined his broad policy objectives in the Middle East, complicated his diplomatic endeavors in other parts of the world, threatened to escalate into a superpower showdown, and revealed the limits of his power to control international developments. Perhaps that is why Johnson considered